So my question to start is, how many of you remember your childhood Christmases? Most. How many had the same Christmas every year for a period of time? Same traditions, same events. When I was a kid, I could have detailed exactly what Christmas looked like because it was the same every year. Every year except the blizzard of 1982. That one changed our Christmas. But every other year when I was a kid, our Christmases went something like this. I knew that the Christmas season was finally here when it came time for our extended family Christmas gathering. My mom has 7 brothers and sisters, and on that side of the family there's about 20 of us cousins, and we all lived in the metro area. And we'd all get together about a week before Christmas at somebody's home. That would rotate every year. And we would have a potluck dinner and a gift exchange. We drew names based on the generations. So we all got one gift. So we would gather, and the kids would play, and the adults would sit and talk, and we'd spend hours together one evening, and we'd open presents. And when I was growing up, when we opened presents, you started with the youngest and went to the oldest, and everybody took a turn, and everybody else sat and watched the other ones. So that took a little while with 30 to 40 of us. As a kid, I remember enjoying that night. As an adult, as I've talked with my parents, they might have had a little different take on how the kids behaved. But I remember that was kind of the start to the week of Christmas for me. Gathering with the family, being with cousins and aunts and uncles, opening a present. It began the season. It didn't feel like Christmas until we had that night. And then came Christmas Eve. So here was my Christmas Eve. We would go to my dad's side, my grandparents, the Clarks. My maiden name is Clark. So we'd start with Christmas Eve at the Clarks. This family was smaller and not quite as rambunctious. So it was an enjoyable night, but by the end of it, my sister and I were usually bored. We were ready to go. And my grandma, I loved her. She was not the best cook, but she tried. And so part of the excitement every Christmas Eve was, what was dinner going to be? And did we eat before? Did we eat when we got home? Some years were wonderful. Those were few and far between, but she tried. And she always made it festive and nice. It was just a different feel than on my mom's side. And we would open presents, and we'd do the same. We'd start with the youngest, and we'd do one at a time, and we'd go in rounds. And it was a fun evening, but we were usually ready to go. So then we would pack up the car and go to my grandma's, my mom's mom, and unload all the presents, because we always spent the night at my grandma's house. We called her Mana. We spent the night at Mana's house on Christmas Eve with one uncle and 2 aunts and all of their kids, my grandma and my great-great-aunt, my mom and dad and my sister and I. And so we'd unload the presents, and this tree was ridiculous with the amount of presents, with the amount of people. We'd stay up, and then we always went to the 11 o'clock Christmas Eve service growing up. So we'd hang out at Grandma's house for a while until it was time to go to worship. And I should have known, even as a child, that going into ministry might be a possibility. Because Christmas Eve service always went the same. As soon as the worship was over, my dad and my sister were out the door. They were in the car, they were ready to go, and more often than not, my sister had to wander back in the church and pull my mom and I out, because we were still standing talking to people long after worship ended. But I remember those nights coming out of church at midnight. And, in my mind, it was always snowing. And it was always beautiful. I don't know how many years that actually happened, but that's the memory. Coming out of worship at midnight, heading back to my grandma's house to spend the night. We wouldn't get there till 12:30, 1 in the morning, and everybody was pretty much still awake. There were usually about a dozen of us grandkids. About 15 years spanned the oldest to the youngest, and we all slept together in one room. It was 2 couches that folded out into beds, and so the older kids would claim the beds, and the younger kids had to be on the floor. And the rule was we couldn't wake up till 6 in the morning. But we never really went to sleep. With that many of us in the room, we never really went to sleep. But we would count. There was a clock on Grandma's VCR, on the TV, that would tell us what time it was. And so every hour, Somebody would wake up and say, "What time is it?" Somebody else would say, "It's only 2:30. Go back to sleep." Every year, we were so excited. There was that energy, and I'm not sure how they ever thought putting 15 of us together in one room we were going to get any sleep, but that was part of the memory. We were all in this room together. We were talking, we were laughing. The parents would come in and tell us to be quiet and go to sleep, and they would go back out, and 20 minutes later, a different parent would come in and tell us to be quiet and go to sleep and go back out. That usually lasted until about 3 in the morning. I now have a new compassion for our parents that I didn't have at the time. So at 6 a.m., there was a tradition. My sister was the oldest of the cousins who spent the night, so she was allowed to go to my parents' room and wake them up. And depending on where my parents slept, if she had to walk upstairs where the tree was and where Santa was, she couldn't look. She couldn't peek. She was trusted not to peek. So she would go wake up my parents, who would then go wake up all the other adults. They would all get their cup of coffee. We thought they took way too long. Once they all had a cup of coffee in hand and they'd all found a spot, 10, 15 of us grandkids could run upstairs and go see what Santa had brought. And I still remember those moments. Whether I was 5 or 15, I still remember those moments of waiting at the bottom of the stairs to run up the stairs and see what everyone got from Santa. And then, by now we had 20 or 30 of us, we would again take turns. Youngest to oldest, one at a time, rounds of opening presents. It took hours. And in my memory, the kids were all great. We all behaved well, we all had fun, we all took turns, nobody tried to jump the line. I'm sure if you talk to all of our parents, it was a little different. So we'd open presents for hours. And then we'd have a big Christmas breakfast, and then we'd all nap. The parents got the couches, the kids we'd all find some empty place around Grandma's house, and we'd take naps, or we'd rest. We didn't have iPads then, so none of us had screens to go sit and play with. So we'd all just go take a nap. Because then the rest of the family, any of the aunts and uncles who hadn't slept over, and cousins and second cousins would all come over, and we'd have a huge potluck dinner to end Christmas Day. And there was usually more presents at that point too. And then we'd go home exhausted. I thought I was exhausted as a kid. I now realize my parents, I don't know how they were making it through the day, other than coffee. And then we'd come home and it felt like Christmas. And I knew we'd experienced Christmas. And I still remember the first Christmas of my childhood, maybe even more young adulthood, when my grandma could no longer host everybody. She just couldn't get the house ready like she used to, and she was just at a place where she couldn't host us all overnight. And there was that first year that we didn't do everything we had done. And the anxiety that I remember that year, when Christmas wasn't going to be Christmas because the traditions weren't going to be the same. I remember that year and how awkward it felt and how it just didn't quite feel like Christmas. And I remember that same anxiety, that same, is this really Christmas? The first year that James and I got married, and we were spending Christmas Day with his family, and it was the first year in my entire life that I was not with my parents and my sister on Christmas morning. And was Christmas really going to be Christmas? I still remember that angst. And this all came to mind this season. I don't know how many times I've heard someone say, "This doesn't feel like Christmas." When we were still having 80-degree weather the first week of Advent, and it didn't feel like Christmas. Have you ever heard yourself say that phrase? It doesn't feel like Christmas. It doesn't feel like it's supposed to feel. I'm not ready for Christmas yet. I know in my own mind, I have had to work on letting go of the traditions that change and tying the feel of Christmas to those traditions. because for 20 years, Christmas was the same for me. And I realized I had gotten stuck in Christmas being tied to the expectations of what it was supposed to be, rather than Christmas being this opportunity to experience something new and wonderful. And was Christmas really tied to the potluck dinner the week before? As a 10-year-old, I would have said yes. I had to learn to let go of that. Would you imagine for me in your head your ideal Christmas? If everything about Christmas went the way you hoped it was going to go, what would Christmas look like? Feel like? What would happen? What wouldn't happen? What is Christmas supposed to be? I hear that comment a lot, and I know I've said it myself. This isn't supposed to be what we do on Christmas. Like I said at the beginning of service, this is my first year ever to have a Christmas morning worship service. And when I realized, I offered to Ryan, since they have young kids, if he wanted to be home with his kids on Christmas morning, because this isn't the first time since I've been a minister that Christmas has been on Sunday morning, but I've always worked with clergy who didn't have young kids. And they said, you stay home with your family. Ryan has young kids. I said, if you want, stay home with your family. I'll do Christmas morning. And after I said that, I kind of went, oh, why did I do that? Why? Jim's saying the same thing. It's a very different Christmas morning. And what does that mean as we experience this holiday that for many of us becomes about tradition? The same things you do year after year, and how does Christmas come when the traditions change and the expectations aren't met? How many family gatherings actually go the way you have them in your head going? That ideal can get in the way. The traditions sometimes get in the way of us experiencing the moment. It was fascinating when I realized that my traditions were getting in the way of experiencing Christmas. It wasn't that Christmas wasn't coming, it was that I wasn't open to what a new Christmas could look like. I wasn't open to really what Christmas is about, and it's not about the tradition staying the same. It's not about the presents. It is about the family gatherings, and it is about the ways we come together. But it's about being open to how God works in those moments, especially when those moments are new and different and unexpected, and they don't match the ideal. They don't match the image in our head. Christmas is here. We're here on Christmas morning. Christmas is ready for us to experience it. The child is in our midst, ready for us to receive him. The question becomes not how do we wait for Christmas to find us, but how do we bring Christmas into this day? How do we bring Christmas into this week? How do we be open to experiencing the birth of the child in whatever traditions we have or traditions that have passed? And whatever you do today and tomorrow, how do you bring Christmas into that moment? So that by the time the season is past, we aren't still saying, it just didn't feel like it was supposed to feel. Rather, we're saying, look at how we brought Christmas to this time. I hope today is filled with those moments when you say, God is present. Merry Christmas.